Woke isn't over. The Odyssey film that's being released this summer proves that. There have and there still are many conservative YouTube essays analyzing woke elements within movies. And all of them have in common that they are quite superficial. I made the following video to go more in depth on this phenomenon. Like, subscribe and follow me on Substack if you think I have a point after you've watched this video. First, there's the trope of swapping the ethnicity of characters. That's quite an obvious one. The woke, or rather the left, which is their actual name for all intents and purposes, are thereby trying to falsify history.
I remember my grandmother saying to me, I don't care what they tell you in school, Cleopatra was black.
They're implying so-called persons of color have always been part of European nations and history. Perhaps they will be successful in that endeavor if there ever comes a generation of Westerners that completely forgets its own roots and confuses these Hollywood reinterpretations of classics for the real things. However, up until now, most blatantly obvious leftist movies have flopped. It's for that reason, and a few others, that this trope is one certain YouTubers enjoy taking apart. It's also great for rage baiting and thus gaining attention. There's nothing wrong with that, but it remains entirely superficial. A trope that also belongs in this section, which however tends to already offend fewer conservative influencers, is the insertion of person of color actors in settings where they don't fit. Even stating that sounds almost like a crime in today's political climate. And I'm not just talking about, say, a medieval TV show set in England or inspired by England, where armies suddenly are portrayed as multicultural, which they certainly weren't in reality. That also applies to certain contemporary settings, especially if you compare the respective characters' heritage to demographic statistics. But I won't say more here. After all, I don't want this video to be censored. The next trope is also a fairly obvious one. It's that of women being attributed certain superpowers. For example, effortlessly beating up men, or effortlessly being smarter than every man by virtue of being a woman. Criticizing that isn't really controversial, and it seems Hollywood has learned its lesson and is slowly returning to providing at least some sort of justification for a female character being overpowered. Personally, I do believe that there is something like a female and male psychology, traits that are more pronounced in their respective group. I also believe that that applies to other collectives, like nations. But I don't expect every Hollywood writer to be an expert psychologist that is able to write compelling and lifelike characters. Still, it tends to make certain movies unwatchable. These blatant examples of propaganda enrage us because they're such brazen attempts of violating archetypal experiences that we've all had in our lives. The intentions behind them aren't hard to gauge. We're offended because we notice the stupidity of the writers and their half-hearted attempts to convince us of their ideologies, against our better judgments. Moving on, we are now already getting into more esoteric territory. The next trope concerns the depiction of children. Anglo-American productions are especially bad in that regard. Children are depicted as pure and revealing the truth, which is not how real children are. Children aren't smart, and they mostly have no qualms about lying either. They are constantly testing the patience of their parents to see what they can get away with. If they could, they'd also kill each other much more readily than adults. The murder rate among children would be higher than among adults if they wouldn't be supervised. There's very few films that actually depict that reality. One of them is the Norwegian supernatural horror movie The Innocents from 2021. This is a progressive trope because the left has a vested interest in depicting humans as naturally good. After all, one of the central progressive narratives is that humans are complete products of their cultural environments. They are socio-economical factors, when in reality they are much more a product of their biology and genes. Of course, they'd claim that children are still closer to that good state of nature, and that adults are estranged from it through decades of evil trauma and the like. Thus, they require their magical kid to show up during the movie and lecture the adult character on his dumb racism based on skin color, or whatever the message requires them to say. That so many Americans find child characters like that compelling is a true black pill. It's wishful thinking, and as such reveals their wishes, their fundamental agreement with the progressive narrative. We are now entering the section of the philosophical meta-narrative of movies and their related tropes. It's here that my own opinions and interpretations start to diverge from that of the Christian conservative viewers. I fashion myself a man of classical taste, as opposed to traditional taste, meaning I'm a follower of pre-Socratic ancient Greek wisdom and a despiser of the unholy alliance of Socratism and Abrahamic religion. So don't expect me to evaluate the following tropes based on their adherence to idiotic concepts, like the hero's journey or Aristotle's misinterpretation of the tragedy, because I won't. If you view it differently, you're welcome to leave a sober comment and I'll answer. The rags to riches trope is the first of those meta-narratives. Rags to riches is just a proverb, of course. I am talking about an arc that sees a commoner ascend and overcome a great obstacle. That's of course not necessarily leftist in itself, but it practically always ends up that way. Because it implies a fundamental equality between social estates like peasants and the nobility. And indeed, often the protagonist even makes an explicit point about actually being equal or superior to the nobles. The only way this could be turned into a right-wing trope is if that commoner in question is actually a true noble heir to the throne. Such is the case for Tolkien's Aragorn, which is one of the few good aspects about Tolkien. At the same time, he has hobbits defeat the ultimate evil, however, and thus kind of contradicts himself. It's reminiscent of what happened to drama in ancient Greece, which started as a tragedy depicting exclusively the god Dionysus as its protagonist, and over time slowly descended to the new comedy, which was about commoners and their daily struggles. In antiquity, before the decline set in, drama was about gods and nobles. And when the original tragedy was rediscovered by Shakespeare, he carried this tradition on. It's a right-wing position to correlate the inborn abilities with the societal rank, and also to focus on what is inborn. The right-winger delights in seeing these various products of nature clash against one another, whereas the left-winger wishes to see them assimilate beneath a shared ideal. Then, of course, I am also a great enemy of the good-evil distinction. Incidentally, that's the precise narrative conservatives want back. But it was never really gone. Even modern anti-hero movies aren't truly beyond good and evil, because the morality is the same as everywhere else in today's world. Basically, you're always able to tell whether an action is good or evil. Even in Game of Thrones that's the case, though George R.R. Martin and Reddit claims the opposite. The good-evil dichotomy rests entirely on a certain morality that has been subversive poison within European culture since it was introduced, namely Christianity. Before Christianity, stories revolved around mainly strength, beauty and power. Look at the Iliad, look at classical tragedies. You'll be hard-pressed to find the writers siding with anyone. That's how a good story ought to be written. But the left is unable to do so because it actually lacks empathy, despite claiming the opposite. The presence of a moral message itself might already be left-wing in nature. It already takes the audience for idiots that require instruction. Conversely, Shakespeare's plays don't have moral instruction, and neither have the classical works he was inspired by. These are the best forms of entertainment. They cast a light on certain aspects of the world, but don't make moral lessons out of them. They respect their audience, because the audience needs to have a certain quality to even appreciate them. There's a reason tragedies have become exceedingly rare in our times, and only the Japanese anime culture sometimes comes somewhat close to it. Besides certain anime, I can also recommend the works of David Lynch, of course. Here too you won't find any moral lessons. These films have an ancient quality, and personally I believe they speak to the core of Europeans. And the final trope I want to draw attention to, the worst offender and my personal arch-nemesis trope, is that of breaking the cycle, which goes hand in hand with the equally dumb phrase making the world a better place. Cycles aren't meant to be broken, they are meant to be affirmed. Genealogically speaking, the practice of cycle breaking comes from Christianity, just like every other progressive trope does. All other religions, which were organic outgrowths of their societies, believed in some sort of cycle, which they most likely deduced from nature, of course, where everything is constantly becoming and nothing really ever ends. On a side note, I also believe the models about the heat death of the universe are ultimately wrong, but of course there's no way of actually knowing that. To be right-wing means accepting the world as it is, accepting its fundamental forces and the amorality of nature. I am not trying to make the world a better place. I'm trying to make my place better in the world. In that way I am identical to every other living creature. The left, or the woke, or the progressive want to turn the world upside down and stop time from running. Their communist and liberal progressive utopias are indistinguishable from death. Both things are the total absence of struggle. Even Hindus and Buddhists who want to escape the cycle of samsara are less delusional than these heirs of Christianity, because they at least accept the world as it is and try to work their way out from there, without trying to make life and power and strength miserable for everyone else. We classical men, on the other hand, affirm all kinds of cycles, even in the highest degree, as eternal recurrence of the same. We don't want a peaceful world because eternal peace means death. A good right-wing subversive plot concept I have would see the protagonist starting out trying to break a cycle he perceives as toxic, only to, in the end up affirming it, as he takes into view the entire world and speaks his great yes to all of it, including its questionable, violent and disgusting aspects. There you have it. I've given you a few tropes and meta-narratives you can use to identify woke or left-leaning movies. And as I've shown, they go far more in-depth than complaints about depictions of girl bosses or any such things. Those of you with a solid philosophical grasp will probably agree with me, and I hope I've made a few things clear for you. Put things into words you hitherto only knew as vague silhouette-like concepts. In the future I plan on reviewing films, video games and a few books. Now you know my criteria. Subscribe to not miss any of it.